Hello, my name is Kristen Bolden, and welcome to The Other Side of History. In our last talk, we talked on the Bohemian reformer, John Huss. And we learned from our last talk that there was a very Protestant influence in the country there of Bohemia. During the time of John Huss, there were warm relations that were between Bohemia and England. Now, the reason for these good relations is largely because of a lady that I would like to talk about in this talk, and her name was Anne. Now, Anne was a Bohemian princess who became Queen of England during Wycliffe's time. Queen Anne was actually Wycliffe's protector. It's been said that if it wasn't for Queen Anne, that Wycliffe would have most certainly been executed. So Anne, she was the oldest daughter of Charles IV. Now, we talked about the Emperor Sigismund, who betrayed John Huss in our last talk. Well, Sigismund was Anne's brother. While Anne was still a girl there in Bohemia, she had been taught many beautiful truths from the scriptures. There were a number of faithful gospel preachers there in Bohemia during her time. Anne was interested in spiritual things and asked many probing questions concerning spiritual truths. Those around Anne knew her as a godly, intelligent young girl with an inquiring mind. She was also renowned for her love of reading. She had a gift of language, and she knew the scriptures in 3 different languages. Her favorite part of the scriptures were the 4 Gospels. King Richard II of England wished to marry Anne. Now, one of the reasons that Anne agreed to marriage with Richard II was because of the positive reports that she had received about their professor there at Oxford, John Wycliffe. December 18, 1381, Anne, she was only 15 years old. She crossed the British Channel with her large entourage. It was a wretched time for travel, and it was actually 700 miles from Prague to London. Now, December was also a season for storms. A storm did rise up after she had already crossed, which destroyed her ship, but at least her life was spared. Now, the wedding negotiations, they actually started in 1377, when Richard was crowned king. The negotiations, they went back and forth, from being on and then being off again. Initially, the proposal had been rejected. It was Pope Urban VI who actually convinced Richard and his council to change their minds and to accept the marriage proposal to Anne. Now, Pope Urban VI was one of the 2 rival popes that were fighting it out at this time. And Pope Urban VI, he needed his supporters, which happened to include both England and Bohemia. He needed them to band together and to be his support. There was some drama that happened with all of these marriage negotiations. And while the arbitrations were going on, at one point, the envoys, they were kidnapped and they were held for ransom on their way back from Bohemia. Anne's family, they were too poor to pay a dowry. So Richard actually had to send a loan of £15,000 to get his bride even to England. While Anne was traveling to London, the English people, they gossiped about her poverty. Much of the money spent came from their taxes, and complaints, they flared as she entered the city there of London. Some protesters even tore down the displays of royal arms crossing imperial arms, a symbol of Richard and Anne's union in marriage. So, poor Anne, she was not received with open arms when she reached London. The Westminster chronicler called her a tiny scrap of humanity. Not exactly a very respectful tone or statement of their new queen. Both Anne and Richard, they were very young. Both Richard and Anne were only 15 years old when they first met and were married. However, their marriage proved to be a very happy one. They fell in love, and the king proved devoted and loyal to his new wife. Anne and Richard's wedding was the 5th royal wedding in Westminster Abbey. And then for, I don't know what reason, it took 537 years until another royal wedding took place there in Westminster Abbey. Richard, he remodeled a palace for Anne and rarely allowed her to leave his side. He just wanted to constantly be with his beloved wife. Richard was kind and generous with Anne's large Bohemian entourage, which also produced dissatisfaction among the Londoners. Richard did a number of building projects in Anne's honor, which is said to be legendary. So remember, Anne's family had a love for the Holy Scriptures. One of Anne's brothers there in Bohemia, he shunned the superstitions of the Roman Church, and he welcomed the new ideas of the Protestant Reformation. His wife also especially enjoyed listening to John Huss's sermons. Anne's brother interceded on Huss's behalf when the Pope tried to forbid him from preaching. Anne's father had actually done much to promote the translation of important spiritual works into both the Czech and German language. Anne was not the only avid reader there in Bohemia. Traditionally, women in Bohemia loved to read. When Anne arrived in England, she had copies of the New Testament in Latin, in the Czech language, and German. She had all of the 4 Gospels in English. Her sister, Margaret, took with her the Psalms in Latin, German, and Polish when she married the king there of Poland. Of course, the Archbishop of York was horrified to hear that the Queen owned copies of the Gospels of which she loved to study. Wycliffe, however, was delighted to learn that Anne loved the Scriptures, and he publicly compared her to the biblical Mary, who sat at Jesus' feet, listening to what the Master had to say. It was because of Anne's encouragement that students from Bohemia made the long journey there to Oxford so that they could study under John Wycliffe and learn of his teachings. When they went back to Bohemia, they took all of Wycliffe's teachings with them. Now remember, it was Wycliffe's teachings that inspired John Huss. Queen Anne was a true Christian, and because of her influence, many of her friends and servants there became dedicated believers in the Protestant Christianity. It is said that because of Anne's influence, Richard's mother, which was Joan of Kent, she interceded for Wycliffe at the 1378 trial. And they say it was because of Anne that she did this. Now, Anne had a kind and a generous heart. In 1381, there was the Peasants' Revolt. The king determined to execute the Lord Mayor of London, who was a participant in the revolt. Anne persuaded Richard to change his punishment from execution to lifelong imprisonment. In 1392, the king was furious because of a loan denial, and he arrested a number of London's officials. He revoked many of the city's privileges, and he charged the city of London with a fine of £100,000. Again, Anne came to the rescue. During a public ceremony, Anne, she begged the king on her knees for the citizens of London. Finally, Richard, he raised her up and actually seated her at his side. He granted the city a pardon. These were the same people, remember, who had ridiculed her when she first came to London. And anyhow, the Londoners, they were so grateful to the king and the queen that they gave the royal couple 2 Christmas gifts. They gave a camel for Richard and a pelican, which was a symbol of maternity, to Anne. However, Anne did not have any children, even though she desperately did want them. And then something actually really tragic happened. And she was only 28 years old, and she died. Now, they said it was of the plague. So Richard and Anne, they had been married for 12 years, and the king, he was grief-stricken. His grief was so great that he demolished the place where she had died. It was actually called the Sheen Manor. After Anne's death, Richard, he vowed that for an entire year he would enter no building except a church where he had spent time there with Anne. A funeral was delayed there for 2 months so that he could plan a magnificent ceremony that was to be in her honor. A magnificent tomb in Westminster was built, where there are still the effigies of Anne and Richard with their hands clasped. The life of Anne is an example of what God can do with anyone who is willing to surrender their lives to him. Like Daniel, who went to the window there to pray, knowing that his enemies wished to destroy him, Anne, she did not hide her faith. Her love of the scriptures and her possession of them was not a secret. John Wycliffe actually used Anne's books as justification in his production of the English Bible. He said, "For it is possible that the noble Queen of England, sister of the Emperor, had the Gospels in 3 languages, Bohemian, German, and Latin. And to call her a heretic for this reason would be diabolical pride." So we can see that Anne, with her Bohemian upbringing, which was an education in the scriptures, and her love for these scriptures, it had a powerful influence for good. If you have enjoyed this little talk, I would just like to encourage you to click on that subscribe and like button, leave your comments, and I just want to thank you for listening, and God bless.